The canyon walls closed around Maude Gentry like the jaws of something ancient and hungry, and she did not look back when she heard the hoofbeats behind her. She knew those hoofbeats. She had been listening for them without meaning to for the better part of 3 weeks, and now that they were real and close and gaining on her, she felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the fact that she was not ready for this conversation. She was not ready to face Elijah Warren and his steady dark eyes, and the way he always seemed to see straight through whatever careful arrangement of composure she had assembled for the occasion. Maude. His voice came from behind her, low and unhurried, carrying the particular authority of a man who had learned that raising his voice was rarely necessary. "Maude Gentry, you stop that horse." She did not stop the horse. Her mare, a gray-dappled animal she had named Clara after her mother, picked her way along the rocky canyon floor with admirable indifference to the drama unfolding on her back. The walls of Red Needle Canyon rose on either side of them, iron-red and ancient, carved by water that had long since moved on to somewhere else. The late afternoon light fell at such an angle that everything looked like it was burning. "I have nothing to say to you," Maude called back, and even to her own ears the statement sounded like exactly what it was, which was a lie told by someone who had too much to say and no safe way to say any of it. She heard him bring his horse alongside hers. She kept her eyes forward. "Maude." There was something different in his voice now. Not the sheriff's voice, not the careful public voice of Elijah Warren, the most respected lawman in Cutter's Bend, New Mexico territory. This was the other voice. The one she had heard exactly twice before, and both times it had cost her something she could not name. "You are too important to ride alone." She pulled Clara to a stop then, because something in those words hit her somewhere below her ribs and she could not pretend otherwise. She turned to look at him finally, and she wished she hadn't, because Elijah Warren on horseback in a burning canyon with his hat pushed back and something raw and unguarded moving across his face was not the kind of sight a woman walked away from easily. "That is not your determination to make," she said. "Maybe not," he agreed, and he held her gaze with the particular patience of a man who had made peace with waiting. "But I'm making it anyway." That was how they ended up, the two of them, stopped in the middle of Red Needle Canyon in the autumn of 1884, with everything that had happened between them and everything that hadn't hanging in the air like the red dust. Their horses had kicked up, settling slowly around them in the last of the day's burning light. But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, suspended between what they had been to each other and what they might yet become, you had to go back 3 weeks. You had to go back to the morning Maude Gentry first rode into Cutter's Bend, with a letter tucked inside her coat, and a secret buried so deep inside her that she had almost convinced herself it wasn't there. Cutter's Bend in 1884 was the kind of town that existed in the particular tension between its rough past and its cautious aspirations toward something more civilized. It had a main street with a telegraph office and a dry goods store and a hotel that had actual glass in its windows, which the proprietor, a widower named Chester Holt, mentioned to every new arrival as proof of the town's refinement. It had a church whose congregation met every Sunday, with the kind of determination that suggested they were not entirely convinced God had taken notice of New Mexico territory yet. It had a jail, a schoolhouse, and a saloon that kept entirely different hours than the church, but served a population that was not entirely distinct from it. And it had Elijah Warren. Elijah had been sheriff of Cutter's Bend for 4 years when Maude arrived. He was 32 years old, broad in the shoulder and spare in speech, with hands that had clearly done hard work long before they had taken up the wearing of a badge. He had come to Cutter's Bend from somewhere east of there that he did not discuss, and in 4 years he had established himself as a man of particular competence and absolute reliability, which in 1884 in New Mexico territory were perhaps the two rarest qualities a person could possess. The morning Maude rode in, Elijah was standing outside the sheriff's office drinking coffee from a tin cup and watching the street with the comfortable alertness of a man who had learned to read the texture of ordinary mornings for anything that did not belong. He noticed her immediately, which would not have been remarkable except that Maude Gentry was the sort of person who was difficult not to notice. Not because she was trying to be noticed. In fact, she appeared to be actively trying to accomplish the opposite, which had the curious effect of making her more conspicuous rather than less. She was riding alone, which was the first thing. A woman alone on the main street of Cutter's Bend at 7 in the morning was not common. She was dressed practically, a traveling dress in dark brown wool that had clearly seen better days, a hat pulled low, her dark hair pinned back with what appeared to be determined efficiency rather than any particular concern for elegance. She was perhaps 27 or 28, he judged, though there was something in the set of her shoulders that suggested she had arrived at whatever composure she was currently displaying through effort rather than ease. She stopped in front of the hotel and dismounted with the practiced movement of someone who had been riding for a long time and was relieved to stop, then immediately arranged her expression into something more composed before she went inside. Elijah finished his coffee and went back to work. He would have thought nothing more of it, except that 30 minutes later Deputy Pete Navarro came in with two pieces of information. The first was that a woman named Maude Gentry had taken a room at the hotel and asked Chester Holt a series of very specific questions about the town, including whether Judge Harold Briggs was currently in residence, which Pete thought was interesting. The second was that a man named Clyde Sutter had been seen riding into town that same morning from the South Road, and Clyde Sutter was a man whose presence in any settlement generally indicated that trouble of a specific and dangerous nature was not far behind him. Elijah wrote both names in his notebook, which was a habit he had, and considered their possible relationship to each other. Judge Harold Briggs was a complicated figure in Cutter's Bend and in the wider territory. He was a legitimate federal judge, appointed and confirmed, and he was also a man who had accumulated a great deal of land and property through legal mechanisms that operated at the very edges of what the law allowed. There were people in Cutter's Bend who were grateful to him, and people who were afraid of him. And occasionally, in Elijah's observation, the same person occupied both categories simultaneously. The judge was currently in residence, having arrived 10 days prior for what he described as a period of rest and business. Clyde Sutter worked for the judge. This was known but not provable, which was the situation with a great many things in Elijah's professional life. He went to the hotel at 9 o'clock that morning, not because he had any official reason to, but because he was a sheriff in a territory where trouble had a habit of arriving quietly, and he preferred to understand what was in his town before it understood itself. Chester Holt told him, with the enthusiastic transparency of a man who had not fully mastered the art of minding his own business, that Miss Gentry had asked specifically about Judge Briggs and had also asked whether there was a land registry office in town. There was not, Chester said, but the county seat at Las Cruces had one, and he had told her so. Elijah knocked on the door of room 4. There was a pause before it opened, the particular length of pause that suggested the person on the other side had considered not opening it at all. Then the door swung back and Maude Gentry looked at him with dark eyes that were simultaneously wary and direct in a combination that he found unexpectedly difficult to look away from. "Miss Gentry," he said. "I'm Elijah Warren. I'm the sheriff here." "I can read a badge," she said, and there was a dry precision to her delivery that was not quite hostility but was not exactly welcome either. "I heard you were asking about Judge Briggs," he said. Something shifted in her expression very briefly, a flicker of something that might have been alarm or might have been calculation. Then it was gone, replaced by a careful neutrality. "I have business with the judge. Is that a problem?" "Not at all," Elijah said. "I just like to know what's happening in my town." "What's happening in your town is that a woman arrived this morning on perfectly legitimate business," Maude said. If that requires a visit from the sheriff, the bar for official concern in Cutter's Bend is lower than I expected." He almost smiled. He caught it before it fully formed, but she saw it anyway. He could tell by the way her expression shifted slightly, some of the defensive edge softening almost imperceptibly. "Do you know Clyde Sutter?" he asked. The softening stopped. There it was again, that flicker, that careful suppression of whatever her first reaction was. "I don't know who that is," she said, and the statement was technically not a lie, he supposed, but it wasn't quite the truth either. "All right," he said. "Welcome to Cutter's Bend, Miss Gentry. You need anything from the sheriff's office, you know where to find it." He tipped his hat and walked away, and he had the distinct and somewhat unsettling feeling that he had just had the first exchange in a conversation that was going to be considerably longer and more complicated than either of them currently intended. He was right about that. Maude stood at the window of her room for a long time after the sheriff left, watching him walk back down the street with the unhurried efficiency of a man who owned the ground. He walked on without needing to make a show of it. She pressed her fingers against the letter inside her coat, feeling the folded paper through the fabric, reassuring herself it was still there. The letter was from her brother, Thomas Gentry, who had been dead for 6 months. She had not told anyone that. She would not tell anyone that, not yet, not until she understood the shape of what she was walking into. Thomas had written the letter 3 months before his death and given it to a friend in Albuquerque with instructions to mail it if anything happened to him. It had arrived at Maude's address in Santa Fe in April, and she had read it sitting on the floor of her kitchen because her legs had stopped working somewhere in the middle of the second paragraph. Thomas had been a surveyor. He had worked for a land company that operated under various names in various places, all of them ultimately connected to a man named Judge Harold Briggs. And Thomas, methodical and honest in a way that had always made Maude simultaneously proud of him and frightened for him, had kept records. He had kept very careful records of land that had been surveyed for transfers that had been registered under fraudulent claims, families and homesteaders who had been pushed off land through a combination of legal manipulation, intimidation, and at least 2 occasions where intimidation had become something worse. Thomas believed he had been discovered. He believed that the people he had been working for knew he was a liability, and he had written to his sister because he needed her to know, and because he had hidden the records somewhere in Cutter's Bend, and because if something happened to him, he wanted someone who would finish what he had started. Something had happened to him. His death had been ruled an accident, a fall from a ridge during a surveying expedition in the Oregon mountains. Maude had traveled to see the site, had spoken to the man who had been with him that day, and had come away with a conviction that settled into her chest like something cold and permanent. It had not been an accident. She was in Cutter's Bend to find Thomas's records. She was in Cutter's Bend to understand exactly what had been done and who had done it, and to get that evidence into the hands of the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe, which would require navigating a situation where the judge himself was in residence, and the men who worked for him were apparently already aware of her arrival. She had not planned for the sheriff. In her experience, local lawmen in territories where powerful men had extensive influence were rarely useful allies. They were too often connected to the powerful men in question, too dependent on their goodwill, too compromised by the particular economics of small-town justice to be trusted with something that could get a person killed. She had intended to treat Elijah Warren as a potential obstacle and nothing more. She had not expected him to be the particular kind of man that he appeared to be. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that appearances and reality were 2 different territories, and she had the fresh grief of her brother's death to remind her what happened when you trusted the wrong person with something that mattered. She went to see Judge Briggs that afternoon. His temporary residence was in the largest of the houses at the east end of Cutter's Bend, a house that belonged to a cattle rancher named Du Bois, who was conveniently in El Paso for the month. The judge received her in what appeared to be a study, a heavy man in his 50s, with the particular easy authority of someone who had spent decades having his comfort attended to. He had steel-gray hair and a manner that was simultaneously cordial and assessing, the manner of a man who understood that information was a form of currency and every conversation was a transaction. "Miss Gentry," he said, gesturing to a chair, "I understand you've come a long way." "From Santa Fe," she confirmed. "And what business does Thomas Gentry's sister have with me?" he asked, and the casual delivery of her brother's name was so perfectly calibrated to unsettle her that she recognized it immediately as deliberate, and recognized it because she had braced for exactly this kind of moment. "I'm interested in land," she said. "I have a small inheritance from our father, and I've been advised that there are acquisition opportunities in this territory." The judge watched her for a moment with the kind of stillness that predators use when they are not yet certain what they're dealing with. "Your brother worked for me," he said. "I know," she said. "He spoke highly of the territory." "Tragic what happened to him?" "Yes," she said, and she held his gaze without flinching and let the silence work for her. "It was." They spoke for 20 minutes, a conversation that was entirely about land and money and entirely about something else. Two people using the surface of an ordinary exchange to take each other's measure beneath it. When she left, she felt the weight of his attention follow her out the door and down the street, and she did not look back. That evening, sitting in the small dining room of the hotel, Maude became aware that she was being watched. Not by the judge, not directly, but by a thin man in a gray coat who ate his supper at a table in the corner, and whose attention returned to her with the regularity of a clock's second hand. Clyde Sutter, she was now reasonably certain. She had done enough preparation before arriving in Cutter's Bend to have descriptions of the judge's regular associates, and this man matched what she had been told. She ate her supper and went upstairs and spent 20 minutes at her window watching the street before she moved the chair in front of the door and lay down on the bed without taking off her boots. She did not sleep well. In the morning, she went to the dry goods store and bought provisions with the deliberate casualness of a woman who was simply supplying herself for a comfortable stay. And while she was there, she struck up a conversation with the storekeeper's wife, a woman named Dolores Aguilar who had lived in Cutter's Bend for 20 years and had opinions about everything and everyone in it. This was by design. There was no more efficient source of accurate information about a community than a woman who had watched it for 2 decades and cared about what it meant. Dolores told her about the judge's land dealings in terms that were careful but clear. She told her about 3 families who had lost homestead claims in the past 4 years through legal challenges they could not afford to fight. She mentioned, with the particular precision of someone who had been waiting for the right listener, that Thomas Gentry had been in Cutter's Bend the month before his death, and that he had spent considerable time in the company of a man named Vicent Espinoza, who kept a small ranch east of town. This was new information. Thomas had not mentioned Vicent Espinoza in his letter. She thanked Dolores and went back to the hotel to think. She was halfway up the hotel stairs when she heard the door open behind her and a voice said, "Miss Gentry, a word." She turned. Elijah Warren stood in the doorway with the afternoon light behind him, and there was something in his expression that was different from their first meeting. The careful neutrality was still there, but it was overlaid now with something more direct, something that suggested he had spent time thinking and had arrived at a point where he preferred honesty to its alternatives. "I know why you're here," he said. The statement hit her with the force of something physical. She came the rest of the way down the stairs and crossed to him in a few quick steps and spoke quietly enough that Chester Holt, visible at his desk in the back, could not hear. "You don't know anything about why I'm here." "Your brother was murdered," Elijah said, equally quiet. "I believe that. I believed it 6 months ago when I sent a letter to the territorial marshal's office that received no response. The judge has connections that run considerably higher than this town, Miss Gentry. I am aware of what he has done. I am aware of what his men are capable of. And I am telling you that if you're here looking for evidence, you are in significantly more danger than you appear to have accounted for." She stared at him. The careful architecture she had constructed for this conversation, the defensive position she had established, the assumptions about his probable loyalties, all of it suddenly required revision, and doing that kind of revision in real time while maintaining composure was extraordinarily difficult. "Why should I trust you?" she asked. It was not a hostile question. It was the only question that mattered. "You shouldn't," he said, with a directness that startled her. "Not on my word alone. You should take your time and watch me and make whatever determination the evidence supports. I'm not asking you to trust me tonight. I'm asking you not to do anything alone until you've had the chance to do that." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Thomas, who had been careful and methodical and honest and had trusted the wrong structure, the wrong system, the wrong assumption that his caution was sufficient protection. She thought about the thin man in the gray coat who had watched her eat supper. "Vicent Espinosa," she said. "Do you know him?" Something moved through Elijah's expression. Not surprise exactly, but the particular quality of a man whose careful reading of a situation has just been confirmed as accurate. "I know him well," he said. "He's a good man. He was a friend of your brother's." "I need to speak with him." "Not tonight," Elijah said. "Not alone. Sutter's been watching you since you arrived, and he's not the only one. Give me a day." She wanted to refuse. She wanted to insist on her own competence and her own right to manage the situation she had come to manage. But she was also honest enough with herself to recognize the difference between courage and carelessness, and 3 weeks alone in Cutter's Bend navigating this particular danger was a long time for one person. "One day," she said. He nodded once and left, and she stood in the hotel lobby for a moment with the peculiar sensation of having given something away that she hadn't entirely intended to, and not being entirely certain it was a mistake. Elijah spent the rest of that day doing what he always did, moving through the town with the unhurried visibility that was one of the genuine tools of his trade, being seen to be present and ordinary and unremarkable, while underneath that surface, he was thinking very carefully about all the pieces of what Maude Gentry had brought into his town, and how they arranged themselves around the fixed points he already knew. He had known about Judge Briggs for 2 years. He had known in the way that you know something you cannot yet prove, an accumulation of small observations and overheard fragments, and the particular behavior of frightened people who will not quite say what frightens them. He had tried official channels, and found them slow and unresponsive in ways that might have been bureaucratic and might have been something else. He had continued to do his job with scrupulous legality because, in his understanding of his own nature, the moment he stepped outside the law to address injustice, he became something he did not want to be, and that was a line he held carefully. But Thomas Gentry's death had bothered him. It had bothered him in a way that ordinary accidents did not, because he had spoken to Thomas in the weeks before his death, and Thomas had been afraid in the specific way of a man who understood his situation clearly and had not yet found a safe exit from it. He had sent his letter to the marshal's office and received nothing back, and then Clyde Sutter had come to town, and now Maude Gentry had come to town, and everything that had been waiting in suspension was beginning to move. He went to see Vicent Espinosa that evening, riding out to the small ranch east of town, where Vicent ran a modest cattle operation, and maintained the particular careful dignity of a man who had survived a great deal and intended to continue surviving. Vicent was in his early 40s, a compact and deliberate man who had been born in New Mexico when it was still Mexico, and who had watched the subsequent transformations of that territory with the patient attention of someone who understands that power and its instruments change form but rarely change character. "She's here," Elijah said, sitting at Vicent's kitchen table with a cup of coffee. "I know," Vicent said. "Thomas told me about her. He said she was the most stubborn person he had ever known and that he meant it as the highest possible compliment." "He wasn't wrong," Elijah said. "What did you tell her?" that she was in danger and she shouldn't move alone. Vicent looked at him with a mild expression that nonetheless carried considerable intelligence. And how did she take that? About as well as you'd expect from a woman who rode 300 miles into the territory alone on the strength of a letter from her dead brother. Vicent was quiet for a moment, warming his hands on his cup. "He hid them here," he said. "The records. Thomas gave them to me for safekeeping. I didn't know what else to do with them after he died. I've been waiting for something." "She's something," Elijah said. The following morning, Elijah came to the hotel and knocked on Maude's door and told her he was taking her to Vicent Espinosa's ranch. She received this information with the same careful neutrality that he was beginning to understand was her primary defense against a world that had given her substantial reason to be defensive. They rode out together, and for most of the ride they were silent, which was a silence of a particular kind, not uncomfortable exactly, but charged with awareness. Maude rode well. She sat her horse with the easy competence of someone who had grown up around horses, rather than merely learned to manage them, and she read the landscape with the attentive interest of someone accustomed to assessing new terrain for its dangers and possibilities. He told her about Vicent on the way. He told her about Thomas's visits to town, the conversations they had had, his belief that Thomas had been building a case with the specific intention of finding a federal authority clean enough to act on it. He was honest about the limitations he had encountered. He did not present himself as a hero or disguise his failures as strategy. He told her what he had done and what he had not been able to do plainly. She listened without interrupting, which he appreciated. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He told me in the letter that he had found one person in Cutter's Bend he was certain he could trust. He didn't say who." Elijah let that sit between them for a moment. "I'll tell you what Vicent tells you, and then you can decide for yourself whether I'm that person." She looked at him then, a direct and searching look that lasted long enough to be something other than casual assessment. "That's a fair answer," she said, and looked back at the road. Vicent received them with the quiet dignity that was his natural register, and served them coffee, and then, after a period of what Maude later privately thought of as the most efficient and emotionally resonant conversation she had ever witnessed between two people who were essentially strangers to each other, he went to a floorboard beneath his kitchen table and produced a tin box that had been sealed with wax. Thomas's records were meticulous. Of course they were. They included survey documents, land transfer applications with forged signatures, a detailed account of 2 specific instances where homesteading families had been removed from their claims through a combination of fraudulent legal proceedings and direct coercion that Vicent could testify to personally, and notes in Thomas's small, careful handwriting that traced the financial flows back to Judge Harold Briggs with a specificity that would have been difficult to dismiss. Maude sat at Vicent's table and read through the documents for over an hour, while Elijah and Vicent talked quietly in the front room. When she finally came out, her face was composed in that particular way it was when she was working very hard to maintain composure, and her eyes were bright in a way that was not quite tears but was the state that exists immediately adjacent to them. "This is enough," she said. "This is sufficient evidence for the marshal's office. The question is getting it there safely," Elijah said, "and to a contact at the marshal's office who isn't already in the judge's pocket." "I have a name," Maude said. "A deputy marshal named Cowboy in Santa Fe. He was a friend of my father's. He's the one I was planning to contact." "I know Cowboy," Elijah said. "He's clean." For the first time since she had arrived, Maude let something shift in her expression that wasn't calculation or careful management. It was something closer to relief, and it lasted only a moment before she gathered herself back to her characteristic composure. But it was real and he saw it, and something in him shifted in response in a way he noted and set aside for later consideration. They made a plan. The plan was careful and took into account the various ways it might be observed or disrupted. It involved Vicent keeping the documents for one more day, while Elijah sent a telegraph to Calloway in Santa Fe, coded in terms they had developed for previous communications, and Maude continued her performance of an ordinary land-interested woman visiting the territory, which would ideally keep the judge's attention in the wrong direction. The problem was Clyde Sutter. Elijah had watched Sutter for 3 days now and had formed a fairly precise understanding of his movements and methods. Sutter was not subtle. He was effective in the particular way of a man whose principal talents were intimidation and violence, but he was not a strategist and he was not patient. The judge used him for situations where finesse was not required, where the simple physical fact of dangerous presence was sufficient to produce the desired result. What Elijah did not know was whether the judge had also brought anyone more capable, anyone whose methods would require more sophisticated detection. He found out the answer to that question 2 days later, when a woman named Clara Holt, no relation to Chester, who worked in the saloon and who had for the past year been passing Elijah small pieces of information about conversations she overheard, told him that a man named Foster had arrived in town the previous night and taken a room. Foster, she described, was quiet and wore good clothes and asked questions without appearing to be asking them. He had asked, in the course of what had seemed like ordinary conversation, about the new woman at the hotel, and about the sheriff, and about whether there had been any recent strangers visiting the Espinosa Ranch. Foster was the problem the plan had not accounted for. Elijah went to Maude that afternoon and told her. She received the information sitting at the small desk in her room, and he saw her work through the implication with the same methodical intelligence she had brought to Thomas's records. Her hands were absolutely still on the surface of the desk, which he was learning to read as a sign of significant internal activity. "We need to move the documents tonight," she said. "If we move too soon, Sutter and Foster will follow the movement and lead themselves straight to what we're trying to protect. If we wait, Foster will have had time to identify Vicent's significance and the documents won't be safe where they are." She looked at him directly. "I know you want to be cautious. I understand why. But my brother was cautious, and he is dead." The silence that followed that statement was not comfortable. It was the silence of something true being recognized by two people simultaneously. "There's a route through Red Needle Canyon," Elijah said slowly, thinking as he spoke. "It's a hard ride and it comes out 10 miles east, which adds time to the route to Santa Fe but means you're not on the main road. If we can get the documents to you tonight and you leave before dawn, you'd be clear of the canyon before anyone following from town could reach you." "I can make that ride," Maude said. "I didn't say you couldn't," he said, and there was something in his tone that shifted the quality of the conversation, that made it briefly about something other than strategy. "I've been managing difficult situations in difficult places for some years," she said, and her voice carried a note of something that might have been the beginning of trust, or the beginning of something that could become trust given sufficient evidence. "I know you have," he said. "I'm not suggesting otherwise." They looked at each other in the small room with the afternoon light coming through the single window, and something happened in that moment that neither of them entirely acknowledged, a recognition, a mutual seeing that was different from assessment or evaluation, and that left a kind of resonance in the air when they looked away. "Tonight, then," Maude said. That night, under a sky thick with stars, Elijah rode out to Vicent's ranch by the back road and collected the tin box. Vicent embraced him briefly, which was something they had never done before, and said, "Keep her safe," which meant Thomas's records, and also, Elijah understood, meant more than that. He brought the box to the hotel by the back way and knocked softly on Maude's window, which was on the ground floor and faced the alley, a detail she had chosen deliberately when she took the room. She was awake and dressed and opened the window without hesitation, and he passed the box to her and she packed it into her saddlebag with the efficient movements of someone who had prepared very carefully for this exact action. 2 hours before dawn," he said quietly. "South on the back road, then east at the dry creek." "I know the route," she said. "I rode it yesterday to memorize it." He hadn't known that. He looked at her for a moment in the window's faint light. You planned this already." "I planned for something like this," she said. "I've been planning since April." "All right," he said. Then, because the situation seemed to call for more, and because he was not, in the end, a man who withheld honest things when they were relevant. "Be careful, Maude." She looked at him with those dark eyes that were direct and wary and layered with things she kept carefully contained. "I will," she said, and the warmth in her voice was small, but it was real, and he carried it back down the alley with him into the dark. He went back to the sheriff's office and sat with the lamp low and his thoughts moving through various arrangements of what he knew and what might happen, and he was doing this at 3 in the morning, when Pete Navarro came in at a run to say that someone had set fire to the hay barn at the edge of town. It was a distraction. He knew it was a distraction before he was out the door. But a fire in a hay barn in a dry autumn in a town built largely of wood was a genuine emergency regardless of its origins, and he spent an hour helping get it under control. And when he finally came back to his office and looked at the time, he knew Maude should have been clear of town half an hour ago. He did not know that Foster had spent the night working through the systematic logic of the situation and had identified the back road as the likely route before the fire had even been set. Maude was halfway through Red Needle Canyon when she became aware that she was not alone. The canyon in the pre-dawn dark was a place of profound quiet and deep shadow, the walls blocking the starlight so that she and Clara moved through a darkness broken only by the faint phosphorescence of pale stone and the distant beginning of a gray dawn somewhere far to the east. She had been riding for an hour and a half and had been thinking about Elijah Warren with a frequency and intensity that she found both distracting and illuminating, and she was in the process of telling herself firmly that this was not the moment for that particular line of thought when she heard something that was not her horse and was not the canyon wind. She stopped Clara and listened. There were 2 of them, she judged. Moving carefully, which was more alarming than careless movement would have been, because it indicated professionalism rather than opportunism. She reached slowly into her coat and took out the small revolver she had carried since leaving Santa Fe, a Smith & Wesson that Thomas had given her 3 years ago and that she had practiced with until she was accurate enough to trust. She assessed her options. Forward was the only one that made sense. The canyon's exit was perhaps half a mile ahead. If she pushed Clara to a full run, she could be out before they could effectively close the distance, but that assumed they were behind her, which she did not yet know with certainty. She was about to move when she heard something else, different in character from the first sounds. A single rider coming from the direction of the canyon's entrance, moving fast and without the studied care of the other sounds, moving with the confident speed of someone who knew the ground. She recognized the rhythm of those hoofbeats and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tightly wound for the past 10 minutes. He appeared around the last bend of the canyon, a dark shape resolving into Elijah Warren on his bay horse, moving at a canter that he brought down to a walk as he reached her. He looked at her face and then past her, and his hand was already resting near his sidearm. "Two of them, I think," she said quietly, "behind and possibly above on the north wall." He nodded once, scanning the dark walls with the practiced assessment of a man who read terrain for a living. "Foster came in from the north approach 10 minutes after you left," he said. "I figured the barn fire was a cover. Can we get out?" "Yes," he said, with the particular certainty of a man who has just made a decision and intends to honor it. "Stay to my left and keep Clara tight to the south wall. The south face has an overhang that provides cover for about 200 yards. If they're on the north rim, that puts us below their angle. And if they're on the canyon floor, then I'll deal with that," he said, in a tone that did not invite elaboration. They moved through the remaining length of the canyon with the particular focused intensity of people navigating genuine danger together. And it was during those 20 minutes that something shifted between them that went beyond the strategic and into something more fundamental. Because danger shared in competent partnership, with each person managing their portion with skill and without panic, has a way of stripping away the careful surface arrangements people maintain and revealing the actual person underneath. Maude moved through the canyon darkness with a steady courage that was not the absence of fear, but the management of it. She kept Clara where Elijah indicated without requiring explanation or argument. She watched the south wall and he watched the north, and they communicated in brief gestures and held glances. And it was efficient and effective, and also unexpectedly intimate in the way that genuine mutual trust always is. A shot came from the north wall when they were perhaps 50 yards from the canyon's mouth. It struck the rock face 6 feet above their heads, chips of stone spraying outward, and Maude kept Clara at exactly the pace they had established without flinching, which struck Elijah, registering it in the fraction of his attention not occupied by the north rim, as one of the more genuinely impressive things he had ever witnessed. He pulled out his rifle in a single smooth motion and put 2 shots at the muzzle flash on the north rim, not to hit anything in the dark at that angle, but to convince whoever was up there that returning fire was an unappealing option. It worked in the sense that there were no further shots from the north wall. They came out of the canyon mouth into the first gray light of dawn, the landscape opening up ahead of them in shades of pewter and pearl, and both of them breathed differently for a moment without speaking, the particular exhalation that follows sustained tension. "That was Foster," Elijah said. "The other one was probably Sutter on the floor trail behind us. He won't follow us out here." "Why not?" "Because I'm the sheriff of Cutter's Bend and he's just crossed into a category of action that he'll need explicit instruction to continue, and getting that instruction takes time." He paused. "We have time, but not as much as I'd like." Maude looked at the landscape ahead, the long open country in the pre-dawn light, the mountains still dark and enormous to the west. She thought about the road to Santa Fe. She thought about Thomas. "How far to Las Cruces?" she asked. 60 miles if we take the direct route," he said. "We can telegraph from there directly to Callaway. He can be in Cutter's Bend within 3 days with the authority to act." "You're coming with me," she said, and it was not quite a question. "I told you," he said, and the canyon and the darkness and the last 20 minutes were still between them, resonant and immediate. "You are too important to ride alone." She looked at him for a moment with the dawn light beginning to color the edges of the eastern hills, and she let herself recognize what was behind his words, not just the practical concern of a lawman ensuring the safety of crucial evidence, but something more personal and more careful and more newly arrived. And she felt something in her own chest that she had been telling herself for weeks was the product of circumstances and proximity and could be safely set aside. "All right," she said. Las Cruces, they rode. The 60 miles to Las Cruces in the early autumn took them through country that was simultaneously harsh and magnificent in the way of New Mexico territory. Wide basins of pale grass between mountain ranges that changed color through the day as the light moved across them. They stopped once to rest the horses and eat from the provisions Maude had brought, sitting on a flat rock beside a thin creek while the horses drank. It was the first time they had been in anything resembling ordinary company since the morning he had knocked on her hotel room door, and the shift from sustained danger to this more ordinary moment created a kind of opening, a space in which things could be said that the constant management of crisis had not allowed. "Tell me about Thomas," Elijah said. She looked at the creek for a moment, and he watched the various carefully maintained things in her expression settle into something more unguarded. "He was 4 years younger than me," she said. "He was better than me in all the ways that matter, kinder, more patient. He believed that things could be made right if you were methodical and honest enough about it." She paused. "I used to think that was naive. Now I think it was just true in a way that the world made expensive." "He was right," Elijah said. "It can be made right, that's why we're here." She looked at him then with an expression that was complicated, that carried grief and something that was working its way toward something other than grief. "Why did you stay in Cutter's Bend?" she asked. "You knew what the judge was. You knew the channels weren't working. You could have left." It was a direct question and it deserved a direct answer. "Because if I leave, the next person who needs the law gets nothing," he said. "And because I spent a long time before I came to Cutter's Bend moving away from things, I decided to stop doing that." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing that. "Where did you come from?" she asked. "Before," he told her. It was not a story he told easily or often, but she had told him something true, and he returned the courtesy with the same currency. He had come from Missouri, from a family with sufficient land and insufficient integrity, from a situation that had required him to choose between loyalty and honesty, and that had cost him most of what he had when he chose the latter. He had worked cattle and then worked law and had learned in the years between Missouri and Cutter's Bend that the thing he valued most in the world was a particular quality of honesty, the kind that held even when it was expensive. Maude listened in the way she did everything, with complete attention and no interruption, and when he finished she said, "That's why Thomas trusted you. He told you about me. He said there was one person in Cutter's Bend who hadn't been bought or frightened," she said. "He didn't give me a name. I think he was protecting that person." "He was protecting you," Elijah said. "He didn't want the name connected to you in case anyone read the letter who wasn't you." She absorbed that in silence. Then she said quietly, "He was always thinking about other people, even at the end." The grief that moved through her expression then was not managed or contained. It was simply there, direct and real, and he did not look away from it or attempt to diminish it with reassurance. He simply sat beside her while she felt it, which was the only honest thing he could offer, and which she seemed, after a moment, to recognize as sufficient. They reached Las Cruces in the late afternoon of the following day. Las Cruces in 1884 was a substantial town by territorial standards, large enough to have a proper telegraph office with regular service, and a federal courthouse where officers of the law could conduct official business. Elijah and Maude went directly to the telegraph office, and Elijah composed the message to Deputy Marshal Calloway in language that was precise and official, and conveyed the gravity of the situation while being appropriately circumspect about specifics. While they waited for a response, they arranged rooms at a hotel significantly larger than Chester Holt's establishment, and ate supper in a proper dining room where the table had a cloth, and there was a choice of 2 meals. This small access to ordinary comfort after 3 days of sustained tension had an effect that neither of them had entirely anticipated, which was that they relaxed, incrementally and somewhat against their wills, into a version of themselves that was less defended. Maude told him about Santa Fe, about the work she had been doing as a notary and legal clerk before Thomas's letter arrived, about the specific quality of her life there, which was independent and purposeful, and lonely in a way she had made her peace with. She talked about her parents, both gone now, about growing up in a household where her father had taught her to read legal documents, and her mother had taught her that the world was not designed with her particular interests in mind, and that this was a problem to be solved through competence rather than complaint. Elijah listened with the full quality of attention he gave to things that mattered to him, and Maude, who had not been listened to in this particular way in some time, felt the warmth of it in a way that was somewhat inconvenient given that she had not yet decided what she was going to do about Elijah Warren. The return message from Calloway came at 9 o'clock that evening. It was brief and authoritative, and confirmed that Calloway was departing Santa Fe for Cutter's Bend at first light with sufficient authority and personnel to act on the evidence presented. He asked that the primary witnesses, meaning Maude and Vicent Espinoza, remain available and that the evidence be secured. Maude sat in the telegraph office and read the message twice, and then something happened that she had not anticipated and could not entirely prevent, which was that her composure broke, not dramatically, not with any particular exhibition, but quietly and completely, the way something under sustained pressure finally releases. She pressed her hand over her eyes and breathed carefully for a moment. Elijah was beside her, He did not speak. He put his hand over hers, warm and steady, and she felt the solidity of him, the genuine, reliable presence of a man who had ridden 60 miles to keep her safe, and had not once made her feel that her mission was secondary to his own concerns. And she thought about Thomas, who had trusted this man with the most important truth he knew. And she thought about the letter that had brought her here. And she thought about all the careful distance she had maintained and all the reasons for it. She turned her hand over and held his. It was a small thing and also an enormous thing, and they both understood it as both simultaneously. "We need to go back tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. "We'll go back tomorrow." They returned to Cutter's Bend the following day, arriving in the late afternoon to find the town apparently unchanged, the main street going about its ordinary business with no visible acknowledgement of the various events that had been set in motion. Elijah went directly to the sheriff's office to find Pete Navarro, with the particular relieved expression of a man who had been hoping for a return, and had not been entirely certain of it. Pete told them that Foster had come back to town the morning after the canyon and had been observed in close conference with the judge, and that the judge had subsequently been notably less visible, spending most of the past 2 days in the Du Bois house with the door closed. Sutter had been quiet. The town had been quiet. The quiet, Pete said, had the quality of something held deliberately rather than something naturally at rest. Elijah instructed Pete to arrest neither Sutter nor Foster until Calloway arrived, which Pete received with the expression of a man who understood the logic of this instruction, but found it personally unsatisfying. He arranged for Vicent Espinoza to come into town and be placed in a secure situation at the sheriff's office until the marshal arrived, and Vicent came willingly and without drama, and sat in Elijah's office drinking coffee with the settled patience of a man who had been waiting a long time and could wait a little longer. He also arranged for Maude to have a room again at Chester Holt's Hotel, but in the back this time, accessible through the interior corridor rather than the main entrance, which Chester facilitated with a willingness that suggested he had a clearer picture of the situation than might have been expected. That evening, Elijah came to Maude's room with a purposefulness that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the other conversation, the one that had been accumulating between them since the morning she had opened her hotel room door and assessed him with those direct and careful eyes. She let him in, and they sat in the small room with 2 chairs that he had arranged facing each other. And for a moment, they were both quiet in the way of people who have spent considerable energy managing urgent external events and are now confronted with an internal event that has been patient enough to wait its turn. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want to say it before tomorrow because tomorrow will be complicated, and the thing I want to tell you is not complicated, and I'd rather it existed separately from the complicated thing." She looked at him with eyes that were, for the first time since he had known her, entirely unguarded. "All right," she said. "I have not met a woman like you before," he said. "I have not met a person like you before, and that is not a statement I make to achieve an effect. It's just the truth. You came here alone for your brother when there was no one else to do it. You have been managing an extraordinarily dangerous situation with intelligence and courage, and you have not asked for protection you didn't want or made yourself smaller than you are to accommodate anyone's comfort. And in the middle of all of that, you have been the person I most want to talk to. That's the thing I wanted to say before tomorrow." Maude held his gaze for a long moment. In the faint lamplight, she looked very much like what she was, a woman who had been carrying a great deal alone for a long time, and was in the presence of something that felt like the genuine article, the real version of the thing she had stopped expecting to find. "I have been telling myself since the 3rd day I was here that what I was feeling toward you was the product of shared danger, and the fact of your being the one person in town I could trust," she said. "I have been telling myself that these are well-known causes of misattributed emotion and that a sensible woman would account for them." "And," he said, "And I am a sensible woman," she said, "who has concluded that sensibility does not actually require me to pretend I don't know the difference between misattributed emotion and the genuine article." She met his eyes with the directness that was so characteristic of her. "What you said about not making herself smaller. I have been doing that my whole life. I stopped doing it somewhere in the middle of Red Needle Canyon." He crossed the small distance between the chairs and took her hands in both of his, and looked at her with everything unguarded and present, the thing he had been carrying since approximately the moment she had turned her hand over in the telegraph office. "Then this is the beginning of something," he said. "Yes," she said, with the simplicity of someone who has finished calculating and arrived at a conclusion they are satisfied with. "I believe it is." He pressed his lips to her forehead, her cheek, the corner of her mouth, gentle and deliberate, and she felt it like something taking up residence in her chest that intended to stay. And she held his face in her hands, and they stayed that way in the quiet room while the stars shifted outside, and Cutter's Bend went about its night, indifferent to the fact that something important had just been decided in a small back room of its only hotel. Deputy Marshal Calloway arrived with 3 men at 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the following day. He was a man in his mid-50s, lean and weathered, with the kind of steady authority that comes from decades of doing difficult work honestly and without shortcuts. He shook Elijah's hand and then Maude's, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has received the letter saying a colleague's sister was coming, and is now meeting the actual person, and finding the gap between expectation and reality to be considerable. "Your brother was a good man," he said. "I'm sorry." "Help me make what he did mean something," Maude said. "That's why I'm here," Calloway said. They spent 4 hours in the sheriff's office going through Thomas's records, with Calloway and his men examining each document with the methodical thoroughness of experienced federal officers building a case. Vicent Espinoza gave a deposition that was both precise and devastating, testifying with the composed clarity of a man who has been waiting for the appropriate opportunity and is now using it fully. Calloway assessed it all and then looked up at Elijah with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally satisfied. "This is sufficient," he said, "more than sufficient." The arrest of Judge Harold Briggs was accomplished that evening with a combination of efficiency and authority that made it almost anticlimactic. Calloway went to the Du Bois house with 2 of his men and a properly executed warrant, and the judge, who was not, in the end, a man with the specific kind of courage that physical circumstances require, came without incident. Sutter and Foster were arrested within the hour by Elijah and Pete Navarro, which was considerably less anticlimactic, and involved a brief period in the alley behind the saloon that resulted in a bruised rib for Pete and a more significantly damaged arrangement of features for Clyde Sutter. Maude watched from the doorway of the sheriff's office as Elijah brought Sutter in, and when he looked up and met her eyes across the street, she felt something that she recognized now without any of the qualifying analysis she had been applying to it. Simply the thing itself, direct and warm and certain. The subsequent days were occupied with the extensive procedural requirements of federal legal proceedings, depositions, evidentiary transfer, statements and counterstatements, and the various administrative consequences that attach themselves to the arrest of a sitting federal judge. Calloway was thorough and professional, and treated Maude as the central evidentiary figure of the case, which she was, giving her work the respect it deserved without any of the condescension that she had anticipated and had prepared to manage. The 3 families who had lost their homestead claims were identified, and their situations documented as part of the official record, which was the beginning of a separate legal process that would take longer but which, Calloway indicated, had a reasonable prospect of success given the quality of the evidence. Elijah handled everything connected to the town's day-to-day management with his characteristic steady competence, ensuring that the disruption of the judge's arrest and the arrival of federal officers did not translate into disorder, and watching with the private satisfaction of a man who has been patient for a long time, with a situation that needed patience the way that the resolution of it unfolded. He found moments in the busy days to be near Maude, not in any dramatic or demonstrative way, but in the way of two people who have agreed on the fundamental thing and are now conducting the ordinary beautiful business of beginning. He brought her coffee in the mornings. She came to find him in the evenings. They walked along the East Road in the late afternoon light and talked about everything and nothing, about her work in Santa Fe, about the territory, about the particular quality of New Mexico light at dusk, which was, they agreed, unlike light anywhere else. Vicent Espinosa watched them with the approval of a man who had been hoping for something like this, and who felt that Thomas Gentry's letter had done its work more completely than Thomas himself had perhaps intended. 2 weeks after Calloway's arrival, with the judge and his associates transferred to federal custody in Santa Fe, and the case established and moving through its proper channels, Maude sat in the sheriff's office with Elijah and a cup of coffee, and the knowledge that her stated reasons for being in Cutter's Bend had been resolved, and the question of her subsequent location was now an open one. "I should go back to Santa Fe," she said, and immediately felt the inadequacy of the word should, its characteristic of being about obligation rather than desire. "You should do whatever you want to do," Elijah said, which was both literally true and also the statement of a man who was very carefully not applying pressure to a decision that belonged entirely to the woman sitting across from him. "What I want," Maude said, looking at him with the full directness that was the quality of her she most valued in herself, "is complicated by the fact that what I want has changed significantly in the past 3 weeks." "What did it used to be?" he asked. "Competence," she said, "sufficiency, a life conducted on my own terms." She paused. "Those things haven't changed, but they used to be sufficient by themselves and they are not any longer." "What's insufficient about them?" "You," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. The lamp on the desk between them sent light across his face, the strong jaw, the dark eyes that always looked at her as though she were the most interesting thing in whatever room they were in. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I've been in Cutter's Bend for 4 years and I intend to be here considerably longer. If you want to go back to Santa Fe and build the life you had there, I will understand that and I will not ask you to be anything other than what you are. But if you want to build something here, I would consider that the best possible version of my future." He held her gaze. "That's not a proposal, that's an honest statement of my position." Maude felt something open in her chest like a window being unlatched in a room that had been closed for a long time. "It's not a proposal," she agreed, "but it's very close to the shape of one." "It's the shape of a question," he said. She looked at him for a long moment and then she smiled, a full and unreserved smile that he had not seen before and that rearranged something in him permanently. "The answer is yes," she said. "To the question that is shaped like a proposal but is not yet a proposal, yes." He came around the desk and pulled her to her feet and held her face in his hands and looked at her with all the careful private accumulated feeling of the past 3 weeks unguarded and fully present. "When it becomes an actual proposal," he said, "I'll get down on one knee and do it properly." "I will hold you to that," she said. He kissed her, properly this time, not the gentle measured beginning of the hotel room, but the full and certain kiss of two people who have found each other and decided on the matter, and are now simply being honest about it. And Maude held his shoulders and kissed him back with the same wholehearted commitment she brought to everything. And outside the window of the Cutter's Bend sheriff's office, the evening deepened into the particular indigo blue that came before the stars, and the town went about its business in the golden lamplight, with no awareness of the important thing happening in the building with the star-shaped badge on the door. She stayed in Cutter's Bend. She wrote to her employer in Santa Fe and arranged her affairs, and then she wrote again to arrange them more permanently. and she set up as a notary and legal clerk in Cutter's Bend, which turned out to have a considerable need for such services that it had been managing without in the absence of anyone with her particular training and capacity. She was good at the work. She was good with people in the precise and non-sentimental way that legal work requires, and the community discovered quickly that Maude Gentry's office on the main street was a place where you could take a complicated situation and have it explained to you honestly. Dollars Aguilar from the dry goods store brought her tamales the first week, which Maude received as the significant gesture of community acceptance it was intended to be. Vicent Espinoza became a friend, a genuine and lasting one, the kind of friendship that forms between people who have passed through difficult circumstances together and discovered in the process that they respect each other. He told her things about Thomas that she hadn't known, small, intimate things about her brother's habits and humor when he was at ease, and these conversations were among the most precious she had in those first months, because grief, she was learning, is not a single thing you move through but a territory with many different chambers, and Vicent had access to some of them that she could not have reached alone. The legal proceedings against Judge Harold Briggs concluded 8 months later with a conviction on multiple counts of land fraud, coercion, and conspiracy, and with a broader inquiry that led to the examination of several additional judges and officials in the territory, whose connections to the judge's network had been usefully illuminated by Thomas Gentry's meticulous records. The 3 displaced homesteading families received formal recognition of their original claims through a process that Calloway managed with the tenacity of a man who had decided to see the whole business through. Thomas's work, it turned out, had been extraordinarily complete, more complete than he had perhaps known. It was the kind of work that only a genuinely honest person could produce, because its value came entirely from its fidelity to what was actually true. Maude thought about this often, in her office, in the early evenings, in the particular quality of New Mexico light that she had come to love the way you love something that was strange to you and has become necessary. She thought about Thomas and what he had believed, and what it had cost him, and what it had ultimately produced. She did not stop grieving him, but the grief settled into its proper proportion, which is different from going away, which is living alongside the love rather than being defined by the loss. Elijah proposed to her on a Sunday afternoon in October, exactly a year after she had ridden into Cutter's Bend. He had taken her out on the East Road on the pretense of an afternoon ride, and he had stopped at a place where the road rose to a small ridge, and you could see 30 miles in every direction, the mountains to the west and the long basins to the east, and the sky above it all so enormous and so blue that it seemed less like weather and more like a fact about the nature of existence. He got down from his horse, and then he got down on one knee, which she had told him she would hold him to and which he clearly remembered, and he looked up at her with the steady dark eyes she had been reading for a year and finding new things in every time, and he said, "Maude Gentry, you are the most extraordinary person I have ever known. I would like to spend the rest of my life having the privilege of your company. Will you marry me?" She was off her horse and had him standing again in approximately 3 seconds and held his face in the way she had come to understand was her particular way of making sure the person she was about to say something important to understood that it was fully meant. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely and entirely yes." He produced a ring that had been his grandmother's, a small turquoise and silver piece that was not fashionable in the Eastern sense, but was beautiful in the genuine sense, and was also, Maude thought, exactly right in a way that told her he knew her very well. They were married in the Cutter's Bend church on a December morning, with the kind of attendance that indicated the town had been invested in this outcome for some time, and was experiencing collective satisfaction in its arrival. Dollars Aguilar cried, which she would later deny. Pete Navarro was the best man, and managed this role with a combination of nervous sincerity and good humor that made the ceremony both more and more enjoyable than such ceremonies typically were. Vicent Espinosa sat in the front pew and watched with the expression of a man who has witnessed something that justifies a great deal. Maude wore a dress the color of deep blue that she had made herself over the preceding 2 months, working on it in the evenings after the office closed, which was not the custom exactly, but was very much the kind of thing Maude Gentry did. She carried a small bunch of winter-dried flowers that dolers had assembled with characteristic decisiveness, and which were, objectively, perfect. When Elijah said his vows, he said them looking at her with the full quality of his attention, the steady and complete gaze that she had first found unnerving, and had come to understand as the most sincere form of presence she had ever experienced. When she said hers, she said them with the directness that was her most characteristic quality, no theatrical emotion, no performance of feeling, simply the clear, articulate statement of a woman who means exactly what she says. They kissed, and the church erupted in the kind of sound that small communities make when something genuinely good happens, the sound of people who have been holding something rooting for and are now releasing it. Their life in Cutter's Bend settled into the particular rich texture of two people who are deeply suited to each other, and who understand this well enough to be grateful for it rather than taking it as a given. They were different in many ways, Maude precise and analytical where Elijah was more intuitive, Maude inclined toward solitude where Elijah was more comfortable with the social dimensions of his work, Maude carrying a reserve that took time to dissolve where Elijah had a native warmth that people received immediately. But they were alike in the things that mattered, in their honesty, in their seriousness about the work they did and its connection to something larger than themselves, in the particular quality of attention they brought to each other. They argued sometimes about real things, because they were both people who had opinions and were accustomed to defending them. These arguments were not the anxious performances of people who are secretly frightened that conflict will break something fragile, but the genuine disagreements of people who trust each other enough to be honest when they see things differently. They were almost always resolved through the combination of Maude's precision and Elijah's patience, which was, they discovered, a remarkably effective combination for most problems. In the spring of their first year of marriage, Maude discovered she was pregnant. She told Elijah on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen of the house they had taken at the north end of Cutter's Bend, sitting across the table from each other with the same domestic geography that had become the setting for most of their important conversations. She told him with the same directness she brought to everything, simply and clearly, watching his face. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something mattered very much, and he was taking it in with the full weight it deserved. Then something moved through his expression that was beyond happiness, something more fundamental than that, more like the recognition of something he hadn't known he was waiting for until it arrived. He came around the table and held her face in his hands and pressed his forehead to hers, and they stayed that way for a long moment, breathing the same air, the kitchen warm around them, the New Mexico evening coming through the window in its particular indigo quality, and everything about the moment was exactly what it was supposed to be. They had a son, born in October, whom they named Thomas Elijah Warren. He arrived with a vigor that suggested he had opinions about the world, and intended to communicate them at volume, and he had Maude's dark eyes and Elijah's set of the jaw and the particular quality of absolute presence in a room that both his parents possessed. Vicent Espinosa came to meet him and held him with the careful tenderness of a man who has known loss and knows what new life is worth. And the expression on his face when he looked at them, Maude and Elijah, and this small new person who bore Thomas Gentry's name, was something Maude kept in her memory afterward like a thing she could take out and look at when she needed to remember that things can in fact work out. Thomas grew into a sturdy and extremely opinionated child who could be found on most evenings in either his mother's office or his father's jailhouse, acquiring a very specific and somewhat unconventional education in legal procedure and the management of difficult situations. Elijah was a father with the same steady, patient quality he brought to everything, the kind of presence that a child could navigate by. And Maude was the kind of mother who answered her son's questions honestly and at full complexity, trusting his capacity to handle the truth, which he almost always could. 2 years after Thomas was born, they had a daughter, whom they named Clara, after Maude's mother and after her mare, which Elijah pointed out was an interesting combinational choice, and Maude pointed out was efficient and correct. Clara was from the beginning the kind of person who combined her father's warmth with her mother's precision, which resulted in an individual who was simultaneously very easy to like and very difficult to deceive, which was an exceptional combination that would serve her well throughout her life. The years in Cutter's Bend were good years. The town grew, as towns in New Mexico Territory did in the 1880s and 1890s, adding a doctor and a second dry goods store, and eventually, a proper schoolhouse with a trained teacher from the East who arrived full of Eastern preconceptions that the community patiently and thoroughly revised. The legal and land situation stabilized as the aftermath of Judge Briggs's case worked its way through the territorial system, and several of the practices he had established were formally addressed, which was not the complete justice that Thomas Gentry's records had perhaps deserved, but was more than had been achieved before. Elijah continued as sheriff for another decade, during which time he built a reputation that extended well beyond Cutter's Bend, a reputation based not on dramatic incidents, but on the consistent quality of his judgment and the particular trust he had earned from a community that included multiple cultures and perspectives, and that required, in a lawman, the ability to see past the various categories that people used to sort each other and respond to what was actually happening. He was offered a position as deputy territorial marshal twice and declined both times, on the grounds that he was doing more useful work where he was, which Calloway, who had made the second offer, received with the resigned respect of a man who knows he is talking to someone who has their priorities straight. Maude's legal work grew steadily in scope and importance. She became the person in Cutter's Bend who people consulted when they needed to understand their rights, which in the territory included a substantial number of situations where the technical law was clear, but the practical reality of applying it was complicated by the various power dynamics that operated in any community. She was not always able to achieve what the law technically provided, but she was always able to tell people the truth about their situation, and the value of that was something the community understood and rewarded with the particular loyalty of people who have been dealt with honestly. She also became, over the years, a correspondent with the women's suffrage movement, writing occasionally for a publication in Albuquerque and contributing to the larger conversation about the legal status of women in the territory with the clear-eyed precision that was her characteristic approach. She was not a radical in the popular sense, but she was deeply and permanently convinced that the system she worked within was incomplete, and she said so with the consistency of someone who intends to be heard rather than merely to speak. Vicent Espinosa was at their table regularly for years, for Sunday suppers and holiday celebrations and the ordinary occasions of friendship, and he watched their children grow and contributed to their education in the form of history and language, and the specific knowledge of this land that 20 years of living on it carefully had given him. Thomas and Clara both grew up speaking Spanish, which Maude approved of, and which turned out to be practically useful in ways that justified the additional effort several times over. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, Elijah and Maude rode out to the East Road Ridge where he had proposed, the same 30-mile view, the same enormous blue sky beginning its translation into evening. They had left the children with Dolores Aguilar, who received them with the enthusiasm of a woman who had been invested in this family's existence from its earliest beginnings. They stood at the top of the ridge with the country spread out before them, the mountains and the basins, and the particular quality of light that had become one of the fundamental facts of their lives. "Tell me what you know that you didn't know 10 years ago," Maude said. It was one of their rituals, these honest inventories, conducted at intervals. Elijah thought about it with the genuine consideration he gave to things. "That certainty is less useful than honesty," he said. "That the right person makes the rest of it possible in ways you can't anticipate in advance. That patience is a form of courage." He looked at her in the evening light. "And that you riding into town that morning was the best thing that has ever happened to this county." She laughed, a genuine full laugh that had taken him a long time to hear, and that he still considered one of the most valuable things in his life. "I was trying to be invisible. You were spectacularly unsuccessful," he said. "What I know that I didn't know," she said, and her voice settled into the serious register that meant she meant the thing completely, "is that it's possible to be entirely known by someone and to find that frightening, and then to find it the safest thing in the world. And that when someone tells you that you're too important to go alone, it doesn't have to mean they don't think you're capable. It can mean that they want to be part of it." He took her hand. "You've always been capable of everything," he said. "I just wanted to be there." "I know," she said, and looked at him with those dark eyes that he had been reading for 10 years and that still showed him new things. "That's exactly what I mean." The sun went down over the mountains in the west in the particular spectacular way of New Mexico Territory sunsets, all reds and golds, and a deep rose that had no equivalent anywhere else. And they stood on the ridge and watched it with the unhurried attention of people who have learned to be present in the good moments, and who know that the good moments are the whole point. Below them, Cutter's Bend settled into its evening, the lamps going on in the windows one by one, the smoke rising from the chimneys into the cooling air, the town they had both chosen and that had, in its imperfect and particular way, chosen them back. It was not a perfect place. It carried its injustices and its complications and the ongoing work of being a community in a changing territory. And Elijah and Maude would continue to be part of that work, separately and together, for many years. But on this ridge, in this light, with 10 years behind them and the rest of their lives ahead, and the mountains turning purple in the dusk and the first stars appearing above the eastern hills, it was everything. They rode back to town in the last of the evening light, side by side, their horses comfortable with each other the way their riders were comfortable with each other. And when they came down the main street of Cutter's Bend with the lamps lit, and the people moving about their ordinary business and their children waiting at Doller's house at the end of the street, it was the particular completeness of two people who have found the right life and are living in the middle of it and know it. Maude Gentry had ridden into this town with a letter and a secret, and a grief so large she had organized her whole existence around managing it. She had found justice for her brother, and she had found something she hadn't known she was looking for, and she had built a life that was real and useful and shared with a man who looked at her the way Elijah Warren looked at her, completely and honestly, and without any reservation at all. And Elijah Warren, who had ridden into a burning canyon after a woman who said she didn't need him, had been right about the one thing that mattered most. She was too important to ride alone. And so, it turned out in the best and most complete sense of the word, was he.